Thank you very much. Thanks for including me in the program. It's been a really interesting conference so far. I've learned a lot. So this paper is with my colleague, Gizem Kosar at the Fed. And it focuses on worker perceptions of earnings growth and employment risks. So it's all about, expectations and risks. Um, uh, these are the views I'm going to express are my own, not the ones from the Federal Reserve. So this paper has a lot of content. There's a lot of parts to it. I know already I won't have time to go through all of it. I'll just mention some of the things, and I just want to focus on some main results and describe the data set to you. It's a panel that is well known among central bankers. Primarily for its measurement of inflation expectations, which obviously is important for monetary policy, but not as well known amongst academics and survey organizations. So I hope you find that interesting. So what the paper is focusing on is really in economic models, it's assumed that people are forward looking, and when they make decisions, they don't just make those decisions based on what they're seeing today, but also about their expectations about the future. So expectations are really important in economic models, but we don't really know that much about expectation, how people form expectations. And that's also true about earnings volatility. We know, people realize shocks in their earnings and in their employment status. That's all observed. We don't know much about how people perceive those risks for the future for themselves. So that's really what we're focusing on here in this paper. So what we do is we analyze the subjective earnings growth expectations of a representative sample of the population. We look at earnings growth uncertainty and perceived employment risks. So the risk of layoff and also the probability that you might quit a job in the future. And then we examine how that changes over someone's life cycle. So we know how actual earnings and employment risk change over the life cycle, but these are perceptions that people have. And then we also look at how they change over the business cycle. I mean, the survey now has been in the field for about 10 years, which of course includes the pandemic. And so it's interesting to see how these perceptions change during that period. Another part of the paper that I probably won't have time to talk about is an experiment. It consists of hypothetical questions where we are interested in the people's perceptions about the persistence in earning shock. So if you get a higher earnings growth this year, what does that imply for the earnings growth in the following year? And that's, again, very important in economic models because that kind of drives savings behavior, especially if there's a lot of risk out there that people see, then there's more precautionary savings. So these things are important to measure. And we have experiments in the paper where we try to uncover this persistence through two ways, one through hypothetical questions, the other one by listing a joint distribution, which sounds like, very complicated, but so if you're interested in that, there's a lot of that in the paper. And then we also connect these earnings expectations to spending growth expectations. So that really also gets to what Scott was talking about, that relationship between spending and income, and spending shocks and income shocks. And that's what this part is looking at. So what we find is we find lots of heterogeneity in people's expectations about earnings growth and about employment risks. So over the life cycle, we see a gradual decline in average wage growth expectations. So when you're young, the higher, and then when it gets older, these growth expectations go down. If you look at uncertainty, that goes down as well. So, older individuals are less uncertain about their earnings growth. When you look at layoff risks, they're actually very stable over the life cycle, and quit probabilities are U-shaped. So they're very high early on in the career, and then towards retirement, you start, seeing an increase again. So that all kind of makes sense. But again, there's a lot of heterogeneity across, different education groups, and we cut the data in many different ways. Then over the business cycle, you see an initial drop in earnings expectations and in quit probabilities and then the jump in layoff risk. But then those kind of quickly reverse. And I'll show you a chart of that. So let me, and then the part that I won't have time to cover is this the perceived persistence in earning shocks. And we find that the persistence is very low. So people don't think that a shock this year and higher than expected earnings growth on the job will have any implications of the earnings growth in the year after that. And that's kind of consistent with the random walk, which is kind of the canonical model in economics of how earnings volatility, how earnings look over time. But that's what people also perceive to be the case. And then on the other hand, spending growth expectations, they do vary quite a bit with income shocks. So there is and then when you actually compare that relationship of spending and earnings for people who have low and high uncertainty, then that relationship is a lot weaker for people with a lot of uncertainty. And that's consistent with economic models that say if you're very uncertain, then you're very, you save more of the money that comes in. If there's an income shock, you kind of save it. You don't spend it. So that's kind of the main results, and I'll show you some charts of that. But the data that this is all based on is called, is coming from the Survey of Consumer Expectations. We started that formally in June 2013, so it's almost 10 years old now. Before that, we had 5 to 6 years of experimentation. We did a lot of qualitative research and a lot of testing of question wording. How do you ask about inflation? How do you ask about all these different difficult concepts? And so now we've been in the field every month. The fielding is done by Nielsen. We recruit people exactly the same way that a lot of the other internet panels are, by using address-based sampling. And then when people are in the panel, they stay in our panel for 12 months, and then we rotate them out. We go back to them sometimes, but that's kind of the deal we make with people. It's we wanted the sample to remain refreshed. So every month there are people rotating in and rotating out. And we ask a lot of questions. And of course, the focus is on expectations, but we also ask about their experiences, what's going on with them in their households, with their jobs and so on. But the expectations, we ask about inflation. That's obviously, a special interest to the Fed. We ask about unemployment, wage growth, home prices, household income, household spending, taxes, government debt, credit access. So we have special modules that we rotate in and out as well in the survey. So every 4 months, there's a set of questions about credit access, whether they applied for any kind of loans, whether they were rejected, or why did they not apply. We have a module about the labor market, about the housing market, about their spending behavior and public policy changes. Now, another feature of our survey is that when we ask about expectations, we do that in a very quantitative way. We do have qualitative questions as well, but a lot of the questions are quantitative. So we ask for a number, what's your point forecast? And then for some of the questions, we also ask about their density forecast. So we ask people to put probabilities in bins for different outcomes. And so we've done a lot of work with that, a lot of experimentation, and it seems to work very well for the vast majority of respondents. And then, all the microdata is also available for research. And by now there's, tons of papers using these data. And so this is an example of a density question. So, and this is the one we focus on in the paper, is year ahead growth, earnings growth. So suppose that 12 months from now, you're still working in the exact same job, working same hours, doing the same kind of work. What's the probability or percent chance that 12 months from now, your earnings have increased by, the different amounts or decreased, right? So people put in numbers in these bins and they have to add up to 100. The exact wording of that question actually came from Dan Bernanke. We were asking, when we asked about inflation, we got some feedback for like which horizons are people most interested in. And earnings growth, this was the wording that was suggested. So it's really about earnings on the job. Everything else constant. So nominal wage growth, how much, and because that's kind of important when you think about, wage growth, wage inflation and price inflation, and whether there could be a cycle where one's, causes the other. And, so these are the things. These are the density questions that we ask. And so you get, let's say this person puts weight in 5 different bins and it kind of looks like that. Then we fit a distribution over that and calculate the mean of that distribution, as well as the IQR, the interquartile range, is a measure of the uncertainty. And those are the measures that we work with. So they go, obviously, you can compare them across people, and it's a more fuller representation. We also look at skew of these distributions. Then for employment risk, we look at the risk, the percent chance that you will lose your job within the next 12 months, and the percent chance that you leave your job voluntarily during the next 12 months. So it's a slightly different kind of risk, but we look at both of them. Sometimes the distinction is not super clear to people either, right? You might quit because you might expect to get laid off, or so this is what you get in aggregates. So these are the average probabilities that all the respondents assign to these different bins. So most of the mass is between 0 and 2 and 2 and 4. So that's the common experience of wage growth on the job. But you see there's a pretty fat right tail. And there are also people who see decreases. They expect decreases because there is a lot of, for a lot of people, there's a lot of volatility. And when you calculate the uncertainty at the individual level, we find it to be correlated with people say that their earnings are very, if you look at qualitative measures, people say that their earnings are very volatile, they go up and down, that shows up here. So these are the life cycle patterns that I was describing. So initially, wage growth expectations are pretty high, and they gradually go down over the life cycle. You also see the quartiles, so about 25% get 1% or less. And then there are also the upper quartiles. There, some people obviously making big increases over the year, and especially at younger ages. Uncertainty, that again measured by the IQR of that density, it goes down over the life cycle, so pretty high early on, but as one gets older, it stabilizes at a lower level. And then on the right side there are tail risks, so the probability of a big increase, that's the one in yellow, is declining, so they're pretty high early on, so there's a chance of a big raise at early ages on the same job. But then the probability of a drop in your earnings, your normal earnings, is fairly stable, slightly increasing, and then goes down. So these are kind of all new kind of measures out there of perceptions people have. And again, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So males, they have higher wage expectations, especially at earlier ages, and not so much as at older ages. And we see also that people with college degrees, they also have higher earnings growth initially. So they will start at a higher level, but they also expect to have higher earnings growth, especially at early ages. Uncertainty is declining overall, but it's much higher for people without a college degree. We also find it to be much higher for people who are self-employed, which also kind of makes sense. Yeah, so all these findings kind of make sense. It's pretty smooth over the life cycle, and then the risk of layoff, the blue line here, is pretty stable over the life cycle, and the quit rates have this U shape, very high early on. People move jobs at a higher rate, and then when you get close to retirement, again you see a higher probability of quits. This is over the business cycle, and the interest here is really what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. So here you see that you see a declining earnings growth expectations just as the pandemic hit. People didn't know what was going on. Everybody got concerned about a recession, but then quickly rebounded. And as you see in the 75th percentile, is actually very high. And so we see this huge wage growth, right, in the last couple of years, and people's perceptions also clearly, and expectations have changed quite a bit. Not so much increase in uncertainty. We actually expected a lot more, a much bigger increase in uncertainty, but it's actually fairly stable. If you look at the distribution a little bit more, there is something going on in the risk of getting a wage cut that went up temporarily, but then it came down again pretty quickly. So all these results are pretty sensible. Yeah, this is let's say the last chart. So layoff expectations at the beginning of COVID, there was a huge increase. People got really worried about, and of course the layoff rate actually did go up a lot, and then it really fell very, very quickly. And the quit expectations, they fell. People wanted to hold on to their jobs, and then even now it hasn't really recovered, which is actually quite interesting. That given how strong the labor market is, you see, and you start seeing people quitting more, but these quit expectations, probability of quitting it over the next 12 months, actually lower than they were than before the pandemic. So let me stop here. There's a lot of other interesting results in the paper about the wage persistence, and also how these expectations vary with expectations about the overall economy. The paper is online, so if you're interested, please take a look. Thanks.